Hello, everybody. Welcome to Ask the Stud number 8. Well, we're just getting on up there in numbers. We're going to have a bunch of great questions again this time, like we have in every one of these. Pretty amazing. Sometimes I think we got the most knowledgeable wrestling fans out there anywhere in the world. And as mentioned in that, we've got places, some other places in the world that are getting in touch with us again on this one. And we got one coming out of Alaska, I think. So, wow, really, really amazing what goes on. But really appreciate everybody coming back and all your comments, great comments about how much you enjoy these Ask the Stud question and answer shows. We're going to try to keep bringing them to you once a month, just like we always have. And we might as well, I guess, get ready and let's get right to it.
Our first question is from John Hanley. Do you know about another hold that Big Jim has talked about, but it's not as much as the warp your head off hold? It was the director's hold. Ron Wright would be sitting in the middle of the ring with some jobber held immobile. Ron would look into the camera and start directing the action. He'd wave his arms, directing the cameraman to pull closer on Ron, and then he'd begin to tell the world what was going to happen Friday night in Knoxville. It was about the time he was called out over his loaded boot, which was sent to the wrestling commissioner in Nashville for x-ray analysis of the boot for foreign objects. It was great then, but really got good when you bought the promotion.
Mr. Hanley, I think it was. Wow. I thought I'd heard just about all the stories about Ron Wright, but this is a good one. This is a new one for me. Obviously, Ron Wright was a big proponent and probably loved the old warp your head off hold. Big Jim S doing there. There's another warp your head off hold and another one. But I never heard about the director's hold. This is a new one for me. But I'm not surprised at all. Because Ron Wright, wow, he was about as far out there as any wrestler in the sport. He was a crazy dude, and pretty much everybody knows it. I flew with him on his airplane, which is a real experience. He's the man that invented the chisel. I mean, wow, he done it all. So let me just go back and kind of relive this for just a second here and try to picture this if I can. So Ron Wright, in the middle of some matches, would get his jobber down that he's about to beat, and he'd put him in some type of hold in which he wasn't going to go anywhere, in which he pretty much had control of him. And then he would, I can see it now, he'd waving the camera in, bring that camera on in here. I got something I want to say, and then as you described it, he kind of talked about what's going to happen next Friday night. So, having watched some of those shows, when I first came to Tennessee and I spent my first Saturday in Knoxville, and I turned on the TV just by accident and caught John Kazana's wrestling show, and it was an experience because I was used to seeing seeing guys like Gordon Soley in Florida handling wrestling, and the way they did it was totally different than what John was doing, I can tell you that. And Ron Wright took pretty much that whole show. I remember watching it, and I remember, wow, so many things that I was thinking, wow, why don't they do this and why don't they do that, and just to make the program better and just to do. But I missed the director's hold. I kind of wish I had seen that, and I got to tell you that Ron was into all different aspects of the sport. I mean, he was just crazy, and so he gets the camera in there on him in a tight shot, and he starts talking about, I don't know why they didn't cut that as a promo. Why didn't they do that after the match was over? I guess Ron always loved talking. That was his deal. He was so good too. And I mean, he had that hillbilly accent, and wow, he was such a great talker that you wanted to give him a lot of time talking, but this is him stealing some extra time talking by having to bring the cameras in there close on him, and while he's holding somebody down, he goes ahead and cuts another promo about the following Friday night. Well, I didn't see that, and I'm glad I heard the last sentence there, something about the, after I got there, it got even better. Well, and I'm glad to hear that, because I don't know that a whole lot of people, when I showed up and we turned it into Southeastern Wrestling, and we brought in Les Thatcher, and especially once we moved the TV out of the old station there, and we went on Channel 10, and we had those great lit up studio and a personality profile and all the different things that we were doing. I think there was a lot of those fans that weren't really maybe happy with the new show, like you're saying you were. But I kind of once I started Southeastern, my plan was to take the show big time. I knew that we had a lot of people that came from the hills and that enjoyed the Chilhowee Park. But wow, once I saw that big Coliseum, I said, that's where I want to go. And in order to get to there, we had to change everything on the show so that it became something that everybody could enjoy. And people from every aspect of life and every profession, from professors. We had professors that loved Southeastern Wrestling. We used to get letters from them, that wow, this is totally different wrestling than what we've ever seen before. And so it was quite an experience working with Ron, and I felt pretty bad for John, because then after I got started thinking about John, he didn't have an opportunity to have a lot of great wrestlers. He was getting a lot of his wrestlers from the mid America territory out of Nashville. My grandfather Roy and Nick Goulis was sending him wrestlers, and the only local guys that he had were really good was Ron Wright and Don Wright and Whitey Caldwell. And he lost Whitey Caldwell. And when Whitey got killed in the car wreck, I think it pretty much killed the wrestling territory for John. And so I think that's one of the reasons that John wanted to sell, because he was really suffering when I took over. But great question, Mr. Hanley. And thank you very much for smartening me up on the old director's hold. And I wish I'd seen it for myself, but sounds like a pretty good description of it. And wow, thank you very much for your question.
Our next question is from Dylan Apple. Ron, let's say when you started in Knoxville and you decided to truly change it up, instead of being part of the NWA, you decided to be part of the AWA and recognize their world championship. Do you think you would have found success under the AWA that you did with the NWA?
Wow, what a great question there, sir. I mean, well, let's talk a little bit about the AWA, because most fans aren't familiar, or certainly as I am, with the American Wrestling Association. It was owned by Vern Gagne, who was an amateur Olympic wrestler, tremendous amateur wrestler, and he's out of Minnesota, up there in that area, in the Midwest, I guess that you would call that, and eventually he spread his territory all the way to San Francisco, but that was later on into the 80s that he had built his territory that big. Then the thing about Vince's territory is Vince was his own champion. And that made sense. Vince was a tremendous wrestler. and a great athlete, had the wrestler's body. Wow, he could do anything as far as a wrestler was concerned. And he didn't have a lot of changes with his championship. Not only that, he didn't have anybody else hardly associated with him. In fact, I think the only person I can remember of associating with him was right at the end of that time frame when Vince was taking over wrestling. Jerry Jarrett out of Memphis started using AWA champion, and rather than so much the NWA champion. And only one of the few guys that I can remember, but I didn't grow up in that part of the country, and I didn't see a whole lot of any of those AWA matches and stuff. I know he had a great commentator, but I know that he had Nick Bockwinkel as his champion. And Nick Bockwinkel, to me, was NWA champion material. I mean, he was definitely worthy of being anybody's world champion. A tremendous wrestler, great wrestler. Spent a lot of time with him when I started in 1970. He spent a lot of time with me, actually. He watched all my matches, and he was great to deal with, and he really taught me a heck of a lot. But that was basically, as far as the AWA went, you had Vern Gagne, you had a Midwestern territory, you had another champion, Nick Bockwinkel, but there weren't a lot of other AWA champions that I can remember, and I'm sure there were, but I don't remember them. But then let's talk about the NWA as compared to the AWA. Now, the NWA was established in 1948. My grandfather was one of the founders of it. There were probably at least 8 or 9 territories that got together in 1948 and formed the National Wrestling Alliance. Their first champion was Lou Thez. And Lou was, he was the Bockwinkel, maybe even better than the Bockwinkel. His reputation was better than the Bockwinkel for sure. But he had Lou, he had all these, and these 8 territories all had great wrestlers. And so when they started naming champions, after Lou came Pat O'Connor, and they had just a lineage of just tremendous wrestlers. And the great thing about the National Wrestling Alliance is all those wrestlers, those champions came from different territories. So when you got a new champion, and especially if it was from your territory, as you can imagine, when Jack Briscoe won the championship in 1973, the NWA World Championship, it lit up Florida wrestling. The best wrestler in the world is Florida. I mean, that's where Jack became famous. And when Terry Funk was champion and Junior was champion and the Amarillo territory out there, then they can say, wow, we got the world champions. And that just went on. Gene Koninsky came out of Canada, a territory out of Canada, and became world champion. O'Connor was St. Louis, Missouri. So, O'Connor was actually from New Zealand. So you got a foreign guy that's champion of the National Wrestling Alliance. So when you consider the advantages that the NWA had, and they continued to grow. It wasn't just they stayed at that 8 or 9 original founders, original members. Wow, they went up to 30 plus from all over the world. It was the organization to be a part of if you were going to be a wrestling promoter. And a lot of them never got in the NWA. There were a lot of promoters that got turned down. And it was a big honor. If you were selected or you were allowed to join the NWA, you were big time. So, and I guess that's kind of my answer. The AWA was never, in my opinion, anywhere near as big time as the National Wrestling Alliance was, as the National Wrestling Alliance champion was either. And and he wrestled all over the world as an NWA champion. You went to Japan, and you went to Mexico, and you went to Australia. You went everywhere because you were the NWA World Champion. And I don't think the AWA ever got that, made that world champion statement real, because they never defended, I don't believe, outside the country. And so great question though, and that's my answer. That's why I never really considered the AWA, to be quite honest with you. My granddad was a part of the NWA. My father owned territories in the NWA, and that's where I wanted to be. That was the best, and I wanted to be a part of it.
Our next question is from Gregory Rose. When you went to small towns like Harlan, Corbin, and Williamsburg, Kentucky, how did you pick out where to have the matches, and how much did it cost?
Great question. Well, let's start with, how did I pick out where to have the matches, the cities, right? And there's an old joke, and Dutch Mantell made the joke. He's the first one to come up with it, because we wrestled in one town. Those towns are fairly large towns compared to a lot of the Kentucky towns that you mentioned there. Corbin and Williamsburg, those type of cities were fairly large towns. But we wrestled one night in a town in Kentucky, and I remember Dutch Mantell coming and asking me, he goes, "Ron, how did you find this town?" Because it was so small that they had a little gym, and there was a little one-lane bridge that went across the little creek that went to the gym. And some kid rode up there, probably 8 or 10 years old, and Dutch got me up onto a bench so I could see it. And he goes, "Ron, look at that. He's on a donkey. He's riding a donkey, this little boy." And he crossed the bridge and he got off, and then we're standing there kind of giggling about it. And then the little boy turned the donkey's head around, was pointing him toward the bridge, and he whacked him on the butt and he said, "Go back home and get Mom and Dad." And the donkey went running off across the bridge, and Dutch turns to me and he goes, "Ron." So I said, "You know how I get it, Dutch?" Which was a joke, but it made sense probably in a way. I said, "I got this giant map of Knoxville all the way up to up into Virginia, over into West Virginia, up to Kentucky, to Lexington, down south." And I said, I got a dart. And I said, I take my dart, and I said, I walk about 3 feet away from that chart, that map there, and I said, I just, boom, throw the dart over my shoulder, and wherever it lands, that's where we wrestle. And he goes, "I knew it, Ron. I knew it was something stupid like that. How did we get in this town?" So what we did is, I came up with something that I don't think wasn't being done anywhere else in the country. A way of promoting small towns, and a way of getting the best facility in these small towns. And the best facilities always, and especially if you're in a state of Kentucky that's basketball country, was your gymnasiums. And if you got yourself a high school, you normally got a gym that's going to hold 2,000 people. In Harlan, Kentucky, I believe Harlan's one of them, the cities that you mentioned. In Harlan, Kentucky, the population was 3,000. When you got to Harlan, there was signs on the side of the road that said population, Harlan, Kentucky, 3,000. And the gym held 3,000. Okay, so, it gave you an idea that the best place and the biggest building you're going to get is going to be a high school, a gymnasium, right? So then I started thinking, well, how do you get high school gyms? Luckily, when I was promoting in West Palm Beach as a young guy, my first year handling any promotions, I came up with the bright idea of going to a high school. It was in Vero Beach, Florida, and talking to the high school principal. And I said, we'd like to bring wrestling here. Well, everybody in Florida knew about wrestling. They all watched the show. It was big time. And he goes, yeah, wow, what do you mean? You want to do it in the gym? I said, yeah, I want to do it in the gym. And well, how you going to pay for it? And I said, I want you to promote it with me. I want you to help me put out cards. I want you to promote it within the school. And I said, I'll give you 20% of what it draws. And so he was like, 20%. He got and it was a big gym. Wow, it was a beautiful gym. And he got I could see that the figures running through his head. Gosh, how many? They put 3,000 in here, and $3, $4 a ticket, that $12,000, $2,500. He was like, wow. And he goes, wow. He goes, I think we'll try that. Let's see what happens. First night we ever ran there, we sold out the gym. We not only sold out the gym, but we had the biggest crowd that the state of Florida had ever had in a small city that had never been run before. So, made headlines. Eddie Graham wanted to promote me, to bring me back to Tampa. Gosh, Ron, I'm going to pull you out of there. You need to be running stuff here in the office. So that's kind of how it worked. I found the towns, and some of it, might have been almost with the dart thrown over the shoulder. Some of them were very, very small, but most of them were all in high schools. And if it were in high schools, then it was the next biggest school below that. And wow, it was just extremely successful, unbelievable. And the high schools were doing so good that I had no problem expanding to schools that I had never been to. When I first started off, I had to talk these guys into it. But then once I could go and say, hey, I'll tell you what, call the coach in Harlan, Kentucky, and ask him what he makes and how he does on his matches. Or call the guy in Williamsburg, Kentucky, and find out. And call this guy, call that guy. And then these principals that I'm actually making the sales pitch to, they'd get on the phone. And then they would be, wow, they'd call me back if we hadn't made a deal. Oh yeah, we'll do this. We'll do it. And so it made my territory, small territory, one major city, a lot of little small towns, but we ran in the best buildings in those towns. And we paid 20% was that's a normal deal. I got to be honest with you, the guy in Harlan, he had a bigger gym, and he bumped me up to 30%. He's the only guy I ever got 30% out of us. But wow, it was fantastic. Everybody knew where it was. You had the police that didn't mind working them. It was just a great deal. It was a great deal for the schools. They took that money, no telling how much that Harlan, Kentucky, as an example. I think they put lights on their football field with the money they made off of wrestling being there. So, great question, though, and thank you very much. That's a most unusual question.
Our next question is from Sav McCallie from Scotland. Ron, which holds are barred that you can use a no-holds-barred match as opposed to a no disqualification match? Thank you for your stories, Mr. Fuller. I listen every week in Scotland.
Wow, Scotland. Wow. Jeez. Pretty amazing, man. I can't believe it. People all over the world. Really, really great. And his name was Sam or Sal or something like that. And McKelvey or something. Okay, so Mr. McKelvey from Scotland, that's a good question. If you're going to have a no disqualification match or you're going to have a no holds barred match, basically, I think those two terms are pretty much the same thing. So, if you've got a no disqualification match, you can just do about anything you want to, and if you got a no holds barred match, obviously there's no hold or jumping off the top rope, throwing guys over the top rope, whatever it is that would normally get you disqualified, you're able to do it. Either one of those no DQ matches, man, are very dangerous matches. And that's why a lot of territories had different rules. Like you couldn't jump off the top rope in some territories. Always throwing a guy over the top rope was a DQ. A large number of holds and things that you used you couldn't do in the regular match that you could always do in a no DQ match. Some holds were even outlawed in some territories. And you pretty much needed to know what the deal was when you went and worked in a new territory. If you had one of these matches about what you could and what you couldn't do. But if you had a no DQ match, you didn't have to worry about doing anything you wanted to. Everything was legal. So, and I don't know about Scotland. I never worked in Europe, in England. Gosh, I wish I had. I always wanted to make a trip over there, in Australia and Japan and all the Caribbean and Mexico and Canada and pretty much everywhere else. But Mr. McKelvey, I've never got a chance to come to Scotland, and I really appreciate you being a fan. Wow, and that you listen to Studcast and that you sent us in a great question here, and the best to you over there in Scotland, my man. I'd love to come see you someday.
Our next question is from Johnny Morgan, Chattanooga, Tennessee. When and where did the Brass Knucks match originate?
Wow, Johnny, Brass Knucks match. I think that they started in my grandfather's territory, which was over in the Mid-America territory. My granddad and Nick Goulas were partners, and I believe probably around 1948 they had the first Brass Knucks match, and they had the perfect guy for it, and I can see why it was. And this guy went on to have. He must have had, after 1948, he must have had 100 Brass Knucks match, but that was Don Fargo, who was just starting, young guy, 1948, in Roy and Nick's Mid-American territory. They had another guy named Gypsy Joe. Gypsy Joe was a great bare knucks type of guy, and brass knucks, a great scrapper and fighter. Not necessarily a great wrestler, kind of like Don Fargo was. Not a great wrestler, but a darn tough son of a gun, and a guy that didn't mind getting busted up. In fact, he liked getting busted up. He loved the sport around his black eyes and his busted eyes. And in fact, he didn't sew this one up. Look at that; it's still out there. Split by about an inch and a half. He was proud of those type of facial injuries, especially. And another one that I'm aware of too, that went on to be a Brass Knucks champion was Ron Wright. Now, it just saved Ron Wright from having to use his chisel. He could go out there and get them tape up their fist and put whatever you wanted to in there, and just bust each other up and bleed all over the ring. And that was Ron Wright's type match. He loved that. So did Don Fargo. So did Gypsy Joe. And then I think it kind of got spread around. I know that they had Brass Knucks match in Florida because I worked that territory. I know that they had them in Amarillo. I know they had them in Dallas. I think the Von Erichs used to do them, and they even had them in Mid-Atlantic with Jim Crockett's territory that had some great wrestlers in it. So they at one point were they were pretty well liked. I mean, they're very popular. But I think as time went on, they died off a little bit, and toward the end, you really didn't see much more Brass Knucks matches. But that is the best I can remember. I think my granddad and Roy, my granddad and Nick, in their Mid-America Championship territory, they started them out. And wow. But they used to do some crazy things too back then, so I can't say that I'm really surprised that it all began in Tennessee.
Our next question is from Brad Freeland. Ron, if a guy's spending more time fixing his tights than selling, how long do you wait before you start throwing live rounds at him?
Brad, I never experienced that, to be honest with you, Brad. You know, guys were always afraid I was going to throw live rounds for no reason at all. You know, much less to be fixing your tights, standing around fixing your tights. You must be talking about a lot of today's wrestling, you know, in which guys are more concerned about their outfit than they are about what they do once the bell rings. And I never had that happen to me. You know, I think the live rounds would have started coming pretty quick, man, in something like that. It's pretty disrespectful. You know, like I say, I got a little story real quickly here. Me and Jimmy Golden, not too long ago, wrestled in actual one of these small towns in which there was a modern day wrestling, right? And we watched the first 3 matches, and in the first 3 matches, you never saw anybody's face. Everybody wore some kind of mask and some kind of outfit, the crazy outfits. It was just, and there was not one single wrestling move. You didn't see any of that. And you saw quite a bit of guys, you know, fixing their outfit. You know, hey gosh, my banana here is, you know, and one of them was wearing a banana, as a matter of fact. He had his whole body covered, and it was all a big, huge banana. Wow, I mean, it just tells you what today's wrestling is compared to what it was in the old day. But Brad, I gotta say, and I can tell you that God that I wrestled, it was me against Mike Jackson, and Jimmy's actually sitting on the outside as a second out there. But I can tell you, the 2 guys I wrestled, they certainly didn't take any time to fix their outfit. You know, I mean, they had enough respect. I guess they knew that, wow, that might not be a good idea.
Our next question is from Gary Bury. Why did Eddie Graham not tell you about Bob Roode trying to steal George Shire's territory when he came to Knoxville, and you made him the booker? Eddie was one of the most powerful men in the NWA at the time, and he had to know about Roop in the San Francisco territory. I think that Roop was one of Eddie's snake pit guys, so he kept quiet about it.
Yeah. Well, that's a really good question. You know, Eddie became, in the 80s, early 80s, Eddie became one of the most influential people in the National Wrestling Alliance. Now, this is after the 1979 incident with Bob Roop and Bob Orton Jr., Ronnie Garvin, Greg Malenko, Ron Wright, the Knoxville Five, deciding that they wanted to own the territory and they were going to open their own company. And I my first thought is that I'm not sure that Eddie ever knew about it, because I never called Eddie. I never talked to Eddie about what was going on. We didn't do what the Georgia territory did. When they had a wrestling war in 1972, they made it known throughout the National Wrestling Alliance, and a lot of the territories sent them wrestlers. I didn't do that. I didn't feel like that it was necessary. I didn't feel like that. I just didn't want to go that direction in trying to fight the war. You know, but Eddie, can't imagine that Eddie really knew, because I never sent out letters to the National Wrestling Alliance, to the people there, and never discussed it. it was not a common knowledge thing in the National Wrestling Alliance about the Knoxville War. A lot of people didn't even realize it was happening. And I prefer to think that Eddie didn't realize it was happening too, because I had a great relationship with Eddie Graham. He is and was one of the most remarkable figures in wrestling. Very, very intelligent, ran a tremendous wrestling company. Wow, Florida wrestling was just as good as it got anywhere in the world. And and I spent 4 years there. I learned so much there. He put me in West Palm Beach and let me run a city that hadn't had matches in 3 or 4 years, and gave me every opportunity. And I spent some time in that snake pit. You're talking about Bob Roop there. I spent time in that snake pit as well. And I've seen Eddie. Scary. Eddie was absolutely scary. I mean, there were some nasty guys in the snake pit, but there was nobody like Eddie. And when you didn't do a job that Eddie liked in the snake pit, then he would always say, "Okay, let me take him." That meant, well, you didn't do what he needs. And wow, when that happened, everybody there knew what's coming. And Eddie didn't do any wrestling moves. He just tore into him. I mean, fists and feet, and wow, it was scary. Like I said, it was scary. First time I ever saw it, he trapped the guy back in the sportatorium, close to the door in the sportatorium, and the guy couldn't get out, and he had him down, and he was putting the boots to him, and I think I stepped up because I had not seen this before, something I'd never seen him do before, and I thought, man, maybe I need to stop this. So I made a move to stop it, and I think Bob Roop was the guy that just grabbed me by the arm, and he said, no. And I could tell by the way he said that he might stop doing it to that guy and start on you. And I was like, whoa, yeah, I don't think I want to go there, no. I guess in answer to your question there, I just don't think Eddie knew. I really don't believe Eddie knew. And I'm pretty sure Eddie would have definitely known. He was really good friends with Roy Shires. He was a big figure at the National Wrestling Alliance meetings. Everybody talked to Eddie. And Eddie knew everybody and pretty much what was going on. But I prefer to think that Eddie didn't know, because Eddie was tremendous friends with my dad and with me and my brother growing up all our lives. Great friends with him and his son Mike. I prefer to think that Eddie didn't know about it, and let's leave it at that.
Our next question is from William Aarons. Ron, did you sell programs at the arena? If so, who wrote and published them for you, and were they good money makers?
Yes, great question right there. And actually, the quick answer is yes, but I'll tell you why. That they were good money makers, and an even more important reason to have programs for sale in your arenas was the fact that they were just good for business, because you could tell stories and things. When I started Southeastern, I didn't have a program for probably the first 2 years. Going into the third year or so, there was no program being sold anywhere. And I was so busy trying to run a company that I just didn't have the time. I didn't have the time to put it, and there's a lot of work to that. You gotta take a lot of pictures, you gotta write the stories, you gotta take it to the printer, you gotta print the printer, you gotta haul them down to the building, and then you gotta find somebody to sell them, and then you gotta account for each one of them, and it just goes on and on and on. So it's it's not a small job. It's not a small thing to tackle, doing a program. But so I remember the first person that ever came to me when he came to Knoxville that wanted to do a program, and this makes sense nowadays because of who he is. And it was my cousin, Roy Lee Welch. And Roy Lee had been in the wrestling business like me all his life. And he had the time. And he came to me, and we were drawing 5,000 people in the Coliseum and 3,000 the next night in Harlan, Kentucky. And we were drawing 20,000 plus people a week. So, you know, we were drawing 1 million people a year in Southeastern wrestling. It was pretty darned amazing what was happening. And Roy came to me and he said, Ron, do you don't have a program? And I said, no, man, I don't have the time to do a program. And I said, would you be interested? Because yes, and Mr. Aarons, I think Mr. Aarons, your name was, there was money to be made in it. But I may be kind of a crazy person, but I told Roy, I said, Roy, if you'll do the programs, he said, Ron, I'll give you 20%, 25% of the sales. I said, Roy, if you'll do the program, I think there's such a necessity, and I think they will help the business. I said, you don't have to give me anything. You just take the time, handle it right, and I know you will, and let's see what you can do with it. Wow. He handled my business for me in Southeastern Gulf Coast. Once we went to Gulf Coast, Roy handled the sales, ticket sales for me in the early years. He did the programs. He did everything down there. But anyway, so Roy goes and makes the first program. We got the territories just in phenomenal shape. We got a match in the Coliseum in which Roy had his arm broken. Ronnie Garvin broke his arm. Ronnie Garvin was a heel. He broke his arm. And then Roy said, I'd like to have a handicap match with Garvin. He said, Garvin, he challenged Garvin. He got an arm in a cast. And he says, and I'll get up, I'll be in the ring too. And you let me bring my guy. And Garvin says, I don't care who it is, and bring anybody you want. And Roy showed up with Andre against Ronnie Garvin. There was more than 5,000 people in the Coliseum. It's basically a sellout. It's sold out. And it was, gosh, Roy never got in the ring. He just stood on the floor and watched like everybody in that Coliseum. It was one of the most amazing matches I ever saw in my life, in which Ronnie Garvin beat Andre the Giant, middle of the ring. Crazy. Did everything to him that you could possibly do. So Roy had made the programs, and that's just a typical night. And not only did he make enough programs, and he would sell, he'd have 5,000 people in the Coliseum, he'd sell 3,000 programs at 50 cents each. So, it's a little bit of bread there. $1,500 or so, he'd do $1,500 in Knoxville. He'd go to Harlan the next night, he'd have 3,000 people, he'd sell 1,500 programs. And every town we went in those days, when talked about this earlier, about how big these gyms were, and they were all packed full, he was probably selling 8,000 programs a week to 20,000 people. And, he was making $4,000, but he had the printing cost, and he had to hire people to sell them, and, he wasn't making, all of it wasn't profit, but still was a tremendous deal. And it was a tremendous deal for Roy, and it was just as good for me and my company because people loved those programs. It was the first thing they wanted to buy when they bought their ticket. And he had his salespeople right there. You buy your ticket and you walk 10 feet further and you buy your program. And it was a phenomenal thing for the business, for Roy. So I guess the answer is pretty simple. Yeah, every big time wrestling organization in the country territory had programs because they were very good for the business and they were good money makers. And what a great question, though. Nobody thinks much about those type of things. Once we went on south, 1979 into 79, so southeastern Knoxville, went down to the Gulf Coast. Wow, we started drawing 30,000 people a week rather than that 20,000. We were doing 2 million people a year, because the cities were bigger, and Roy was right there with those programs again, man. He was still doing it, taking care of the ticket sales and the box office, and selling the programs as well. So, tremendous money maker. You're right about that. You ask about it. It was a phenomenal money maker, and to me, even more important, it was good for business. It just everybody learned everything they needed to know about what was happening.
Our next question is from Timothy DeBartolin, Atlanta, Georgia. Always wished you would work the Atlanta market more. Was there a reason you stayed away? Fans of yours from Briarcliff High School days, where you were a basketball star, don't know if you are aware, but you are one of the only 3 students recognized as the most notable alumni in history and as a professional wrestler. I thought you would also play in the NBA.
Wow, Timothy, that's a good question, man. A whole lot of things in that. Wrestling in Atlanta. I think you started out with me not coming to wrestle nearly enough in Atlanta, and what was the reason for it? Actually, I did wrestle quite a bit in Atlanta. When I first started my career in 1970, I wrestled my first 7 months in Georgia, and wrestled in Atlanta, but pretty much every Friday night. I was lucky. Me and my brother were just getting started, and we wrestled in Atlanta, luckily, pretty much every Friday night. Then I went to Florida from there and spent some time there, and then I came back in 1972 when Atlanta got its war started, and they brought me in there, and I wrestled at Hiro Matsuda there. I wrestled the Georgia heavyweight champion Bill Watts for the Georgia championship, middle of the war. And I beat Bill Watts, and 2 weeks later I came back and wrestled Wrestling 2 when he was red hot. He had just become the star there. And I lost the match, and he became the champion. Then during the course of the war, they started running matches right after the war in the Omni in Atlanta. Big, beautiful building. Wow, 20,000 people. And I remember me and Robin, my dad, wrestling Ronnie Garvin and Terrence and the young kid, Jim Garvin, David Jim. In a 6-man tag in the Omni. So we came back just at the end of that war and during the war, and we were some of the good big crowd drawers for them because my dad had spent a whole lot of time there, and my brother and I were growing up, and we came back in 1973 and 1974. Wow, I was wrestling in St. Louis and some of the biggest cities in the world, and been to Australia and done everything else. So, we were right up there on the card. Second match down from the top, whatever, really, really big on the card. So, and the reason that I didn't do more is in 1974, I started my own company, Southeastern in Knoxville, and I quit wrestling for anybody other than myself. And that was kind of the whole idea of having your own territory. is that you didn't have to leave. You know, that was the hard thing about being a wrestler. You couldn't stay forever in a territory. But if you owned the territory, you never had to leave. You owned it. And usually you did so well with promotions and with owning the company that you didn't need to go earn money somewhere else. So that's kind of why I never came back to Atlanta, because I had my own territory. I wanted to wrestle for myself. And not only did I want to wrestle for myself, I wanted to be there and see how everybody else wrestled that night as well, because you needed to know what was going on. And that was a part of being an owner of a territory. You saw something you didn't like, you didn't hesitate to go in and talk to somebody about it. Let's get this straightened out, you know. And then about the school deal. And, you know, that's kind of crazy. My grandson, you know, this is probably maybe 3 months ago. My grandson, who started school today as a sophomore, 6 feet 9 inches tall, 240 pounds, and 16 years old. And he sent me something on my Facebook site. He said, look at this. You know, he goes, this came from your high school. So he had taken the time, go on the internet and look up what I did in my high school days, playing basketball. And it showed there that I was one of the only 3 alumni that were famous, that were considered famous. One of them was a state senator. That was me. Second one recognized as a professional wrestler, and I can't remember what the third person was and what he did. But anyway, you know, that's quite an honor. You know, I had no idea, and you bring it up again, you know. So yeah, I kind of knew about it, but you know, and then you know, it's a great deal, man. Atlanta, I love that city. It's just a tremendous wrestling market. Always has been a great market there, and always enjoyed wrestling in Atlanta. You know, and Briarcliff, great high school. I don't think it's there anymore. From what I hear, from what my grandson was telling me, the school is not there anymore. But in the 40 years that it was there, I was on the best basketball team they ever had. MVP on the best team they ever had there in 40 years. So, you know, but great question, man. I didn't expect that kind of question, but thank you very much, Timothy, and I hope to get back to visiting Atlanta soon. I love it.
Our next question is from Jonathan Blaisdell, Nome, Alaska. Recently discovered your studcast and have listened to the last 10 of them. Was never aware that there were wars over who controlled certain parts of the country. How often did that type of thing happen, and where else in the United States did it happen?
Nome, Alaska. Can't believe that. We got somebody from Alaska and somebody from Scotland. Now, I don't know which one is further from where we're sitting right now, whether Alaska or Scotland. But great question, you know, and wrestling wars, man. You know, I'm certainly not a historian about wrestling wars and where all they have occurred, but I know that they've had wrestling wars for you know, I think my granddad built his territory around basically a wrestling war, if that's what you could call it. He would go into those towns and take over and manhandle whoever was there, send them all home, and said, "You're through. You know, I'm the promoter now. I own these." You know, that's kind of a war, I would say, in a way. But the only one, the one I'm most familiar with, is the one that happened in 1972 in Georgia. And it had involved family members. My dad had sold his half of the Georgia Territory company to his uncle, Lester Welch. Ray Gunkel was Lester's partner. They didn't get along, and Ray decided that he was going to take over the territory. It turned into a hard deal, a bad deal, and it went on for 2 or 3 years. Totally different type of conflict than what I was having with the Knoxville Five. In my war, these guys that I was wrestling against wanted to do whatever they can, publicity-wise or anything else, to create bad relationship between the two companies. They were like they wanted to fight, like they wanted to suggest that what we did wasn't real. They just ads in the paper about challenges, just crazy things that never happened in the Atlanta War, which made the Knoxville War a heck of a lot worse war. The Atlanta War, the great thing about that war, and probably the most unusual thing about that war of any wrestling war, traditionally, if you had a war in your territory might die. That war could, in most cases, kill the territory, where it was not the moneymaker that it was before. That didn't happen in the Atlanta War because both sides in that Atlanta War didn't make any remarks about the other side. They didn't pay any attention to. They tried to build their own company and do well their own night. They ran in the Atlanta Auditorium. One of those companies on Friday night and the other on a Saturday night. Both of them sold out. Crazy. That this didn't never happen in wrestling wars. But Atlanta was such a hot wrestling town that, fans just loved it. And they came both nights. That didn't happen. The Knoxville War, it's going to eventually kill the territory. The way the guys, they were wanting to handle their opposition, they didn't win the war. I sold out, so I didn't leave empty-handed. I got paid something for my work there for 5 years. Wrestling wars were a really strange thing. It's a great question, and I noticed that you say you've heard the last 10 Studcast, and that's pretty amazing up in Alaska there. I know we're everywhere. You can find us just about everywhere. And I really, really appreciate that. And sounds like you're a pretty darn good fan. You've got some real good question here. And I wouldn't mind coming and visiting somebody in Nome, Alaska either, man. So, maybe get in touch and I might jump on a jet, man, and fly up there to Nome.
Our final question is from Glenn David Centers. If Tor Tanaka, Joe LeDuc, and the Stomper got in a fight, who's coming out on top?
Mr. Centers? Wow. That was one heck of a question, I can tell you that. And you got 3 heels there. I noticed that. Well, Joe, not necessarily. Joe wasn't always a heel, and neither was Tanaka, actually. So, wow. I'd like to see it. I'd be the first one to buy a ticket for that. That would be one heck of a war. Tanaka, jeez. And as solid as a rock, he was so monstrously big, his entire bulky body, but it was hard as a rock. Joe LeDuc, a maniac, a crazy man. They take the axe and slice his darn arms, bleed. He cuts himself. He probably had more ruts in his forehead from being busted and cut. And wow, it's just unbelievable. Mongolian Stomper, it was a machine, and in the best shape I have ever seen anybody, I think, in my life. I got a real quick story about it. I'm not saying that I picked the Mongol here, but I got a quick story about the Mongol. My sons and I went to work out in the gym in Knoxville, Tennessee, this was when USA was probably 1988, summer of 1988. And when we went in the gym, it was a 2-level gym, one of those big gyms. And a 2-level gym, and they looked upstairs, and there was on the stair climbing machine was a Mongolian stomper. And my boys were like, they had never been around him, and they really didn't know what he was all about, and so, but Dad, that's just check the stomper out up there. And he was sweating. He was wearing that stepper machine out. He was just, and the sweat was pouring off of him. And so they said, how long do you think he can go like that? And I said, I don't know, let's see. I knew how long it was going to be, but I didn't want to tell them I wanted it. And so we started working out. We worked out for close to an hour. And when we got through at the hour, he was still going. And they said, Dad, they go, how in the heck can anybody do that? And I said, guys, there's nobody got a set of lungs like that guy's got, man. I said, I've never seen him blow up. I said, I've wrestled him for hour matches, and I've never seen him blow up. I said, we might could go and have lunch and come back. He'd still be up there.